This is a preview of my Python backend course. If you'd be interested in this, check out the link down in the pinned comment or in the description. Welcome everybody to section 2. All of the previous section, the first 5 videos, were the basics. Just talking about the important concepts, how to get our environment set up, but now we actually want to start creating a Django project. So this is a little bit more applied. We're going to start with actual web development. So this first video is going to be the basics, getting Django set up. The next video, the goal is to have a Git repository set up for our project, and we can push that code up to the interwebs, and then talking some specifics on Django concepts like views and templates in the following videos. So let's get started. My goal is to go in as much detail as possible so you have a really solid understanding. Before we jump too deep into it, I wanted to talk really briefly about 2 different approaches to web development. We're actually going to be going through both of these approaches in this course, and that's so you can get a full understanding of the different possibilities. So the first approach is to do everything within the web server, do all the processing in the web server, and render the HTML files from the web server and send those to the client. In this situation, you are not going to need any fancy frameworks in JavaScript or worry about APIs or anything. And this is what in Django is known as the MVT approach, Model View Template. The alternative approach is to actually split this up into multiple applications. So you would have the Django application, which will be there to serve data, and then you'll have a front-end application to consume that data. In this situation, you'll be working with APIs and a front-end technology like JavaScript or some framework like React. Which one's superior? Well, my personal preference is to go with that second option where you create an API and have a dedicated front-end application. I just think that's what's most commonly going to be done in the real world. And if you have a hard time kind of visualizing, don't worry about it because we're going to go through this slower. I'm just saying that up front for those of you who want to be building the API and doing the single page applications, we are going to get to that in this course. A lot of the foundation is going to be the same, so it's essential to start with what we're going to be talking about in this section. So let's get started, jump into the code, and we'll just start with a clean slate. So we're still in this directory called files, but inside of there, I got rid of everything so we can just all start on the same page. So the very first thing is we're going to create a virtual environment, and I'll zoom in just a tiny bit so you can see this a little bit better. Python 3-m venv, and we'll call that .venv. We've done this about 1,000 times now. For this, we'll just go ahead and say no, and then we will activate this. And we'll just start installing packages one at a time as we go. If we find we need anything, then we'll just go in and install it, which is probably going to be the most realistic way of building an application, because you might not know everything you need ahead of time. All right, so we installed Django. Pip install Django. Now the most important command that comes with this is django-admin. So you should be able to type that out. You can see we get this big red error. Don't worry about that. But you will notice there are a bunch of these subcommands. So you can say Django followed by one of these. Now, a little bit about this error. A lot of these commands can be issued through another Python file that'll set up the environment better for us, and it'll do this for us so we won't have to worry about that error. So we're only going to need one command, and that is django-admin startproject. So it's going to look something like this. We say django-admin start project, and then the name of the project, we're going to call it the same thing, files. So we're in a files directory, and then we create a project called files. And then the path, which we'll just use the current directory with a dot. That's why I recommend to already be in a directory, so we're not just polluting some other directory with a bunch of files. We'll hit enter, and you can see we get a manage.py. This is the file I was talking about earlier that we're going to execute any of those commands through. And then we have our app called files with some files inside of it. So get used to this file setup. It's a little strange. Now this outer directory files, you could have named it something else. It doesn't have to match this necessarily, but by convention, this is what I do. A lot of other people will do, and you'll see this a lot. So the entire goal of this is to create an application surrounding files, something like Google Drive, for example. The manage.py and the virtual environment directory are tools that are going to be used throughout this entire thing. So the app-specific stuff is going to be within this nested directory files. So it's a little confusing at first, but just take a mental snapshot of that. and you'll get used to it. Now, if you weren't doing it in the current directory, you could just say django-admin, startproject, files, and then some directory name like files, or maybe just some general folder name. That would work as well, but we already had the files directory because we created the virtual environment first. We wanted to install Django within that virtual environment. That's why I created that files directory ahead of time. So the next important thing you need to understand is this manage.py file. That's how we issue different commands surrounding our application. So the way you execute this is with Python manage.py. And the first command we're going to learn is run server. Hit enter. You're going to get an error, 18 unapplied migrations. We'll talk about this in great detail in the next section. If you're coming from any other web development frameworks, you're probably a little bit familiar with database migrations, but for now, don't worry about it. You will notice another thing, it created this db.sqlite3 database. So that's cool. It automatically created a database for us. We'll be using that as well. And then we get another error. That port is already in use. That's my bad because I already have a Django application running, so I'll go stop that and then restart this server. All right, that should be halted. So we'll go ahead and run that same command. Hit enter. You still get this message about the migrations. Again, ignore that for right now, but you will notice we now have a URL on 127.0.0.1, which this is localhost. It's basically running on our local computer. So this is exactly what it's going to look like when you open it. If you're in Visual Studio Code, you can hold Command to open a link. So you can see Command will turn this cursor into a little clicking icon, probably Control on Windows. So that's handy. Now you will want to make sure you can see this page before moving on. If you don't see this page for any reason, do some debugging, make sure you follow along. If you need, rewatch this video and go through the steps again. So this is a website, but it's not really running out on the internet. It's running locally on a mini web server that comes with Django, but this web server is not recommended for any kind of deployment. So AWS is going to provide those deployment servers in our case, but you could use a lot of other web hosts out there, whether that's Azure or Heroku or Google Cloud or any of these other options out there. But either way, the local host server is probably going to be the same. The server is going to continue to run in the background, so if we make any changes to our files, it'll update those files and serve the updated content. So for this, what we need is we need the server running at all times, but we may still need to execute commands inside of the terminal. So what I like to do is I like to actually open another terminal. Or what you can do is you could split the terminal with this button here. So we'll hit that. And now we can issue commands to install packages or whatever else we need here while we have this server running. And you can actually change the sides of these so you can have the commands over here. And we can just kind of scoot that over just so we can see if there's any errors or if it stopped running. So I'm going to actually make that just a little bit bigger. And for this one over here on the left, we'll want to make sure we're in that same path, which we are. We're in our files directory, and we're going to want to make sure that we activate the same virtual environment. So venv bin activate. Now, this is in the same state as this one was right before we issued that server command. Okay, so we should have our environment set up pretty well. Now I just want to talk a little bit more about web servers and requests. So let's just take a look at some of these in more detail. You can see a bunch of these get in all capital letters, and then the actual file that is being retrieved. This is our first time requesting this information, so there's not going to be any kind of caching going on. So these are all cold retrievals, and we get that from the server. Now the server is running on our computer, so you can kind of just think about it as we have these files over here, and on the same computer we access those files, so it's a little strange. But anytime you're on your development journey and you see 127.0.0.1, this is your own computer. Same thing with a localhost. So we could replace this here with localhost, and that should work as well. Let's hit enter, and you can see we get the same page. So localhost is just a nice alias for that IP address. It's called the loopback IP address if you want to do more research. Now this 8000, this is the port, and you can consider localhost or that IP address to be the destination. 127.0.0.1, and then you can consider that 8000 to be the door that we go through to reach that destination. For live websites on the internet, port 80 is the default, and it usually won't be shown. Another option would be 443 for HTTPS, which also is not shown. When you're visiting websites on the internet, you're not seeing these ports. But just to show this in action, you can go to google.com:80, for example, hitting enter, and that'll resolve to google.com. Same thing with 443, that will resolve. But if you try some port that is unaccepted, such as 8080, well, that's not going to resolve. And you can see it's just spinning and it'll likely error out here eventually. All right, so on local, what you can do is you can change that port because you can't have multiple applications running on the same port. So to do that, when you start the server, which you can exit the server with Control-C, that will exit out. When you start, you can say Python manage.py run server and then some port number like 1234, and that will put it on a new port. So now you visit it with a :1234. So that's how you could have multiple Django apps running at the same time, just putting them on different ports. However, I'm just going to keep it as the default, so I'm going to close out of this and issue the default run server, and then I'll put it on 8000. Now anytime we request this page, it's going to make a request, and now you're going to see a different response than we did earlier. You can see it's blue, and we have some 304s instead of 200. Let's just talk about what some of these things mean. The very first thing here is the timestamp. This is when the resource was requested. The next is the method, in this case, get. There's multiple methods out there. Get and post are the most common two, but we're going to talk about others in this course. Then the location of the file being requested, then the protocol HTTP 1.1, then the response code 304 in this case, and then the actual data downloaded, in this case 0. So the file size is 0 because there was some caching happening. So 200 means okay, which is what you get when you request a page and it gives you a response. 304 means not modified, and what this is saying is that the server file has not been modified since the last time you requested it. So you can just use the one you already downloaded earlier, because browsers are very advanced and will cache files. Cache meaning save those files so they don't have to keep downloading them. And this is why it might be the case when you visit a website for the very first time, it can take a little bit of time for it to load. But that second time you visit it, it's much faster. That's because a lot of the files you need are cached in your web browser, such as Google Chrome, Firefox, or Edge. Which browser you use, it doesn't really matter because a lot of these browsers are going to work exactly the same way. I'm using Chrome for this course if you want to follow along exactly. So this is awesome because you're putting less load on the server. You can see the server didn't have to send any data for all of these blue files here. Now I want to try something else. You can see there's multiple requests here to fonts.css, this web font. Well, let's go back and do another refresh. And we'll just do a couple extra refreshes. So now when we take a look back at our request log, you can see this big stream of this get / for the home page, but none of these other files showed up again. So what's going on? When do we need to request these files and when do we not need to request these files? Well, I'm not trying to get too deep into this because, we're just getting started, but I do want this course to be a little bit deeper than most out there. So here's what happens. You make a request, and that very first time, if we scroll up even farther, when we got everything, you can see it right here. This is the first time we got that data. You can see get, and nothing's blue. Everything is a brand new download and we have to download that information. When we scroll down and we see these blue ones, it's basically checking to see if there was any change to the server. So it still makes a request to the server. And the server says, no bro, no changes have happened. You can just keep the file you already have. So it still makes a request to the server. It's just very, very quick because no actual data is downloaded. Well, these files on the local web browser get cached and will expire at some point in the future. But for now, it's not even going to request those files. So the future requests don't even request those files at all. If we waited a certain period of time, the web browser might get curious and ask, hey, maybe these files are outdated and we need to request new ones. And in that situation, since we haven't changed any files, we would get a 304 again and have a 0 download size. When that expiration happens, not entirely sure, but you can go in here and try it, do a refresh, see if anything changed, and you can see it tried to request the fonts again, and there was no change, so we get the 304 not modified. You can see some of this information from the browser by right-clicking and going inspect, and then this will bring up the developer tools, which you can click this little arrow here and go to the network tab. Now when you do a refresh, it's going to show all of the different requests you made. So you can expand this if you want to see a little bit more information, and you can see over here the size memory cached, and that's for the fonts and these other fonts as well. And as you do more refreshes, it'll give you a new list. If you hold down the refresh button while you have the developer tools open, you can empty cache and hard reload. It's going to take a lot more time, and it's going to download all those again. So you can see that took a lot longer, and now we're not getting any of these memory cached. All these are fresh requests over here on the server. Before we move on to the next video, there's one last thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to Django setup. We were worried about two commands. The first being the django-admin command, which we did one time to start our project, and then the manage.py command, which is a Python file that we used to start our server. Well, this manage.py file, which you can see inside our files here, is basically a wrapper around that django-admin command. So if you remember from earlier, when we said django-admin, we got this error here saying we needed to set up some environment stuff. Well, all of that is done for us inside of this manage.py file. So now that we're done typing little tiny commands in the terminal for now, I'm going to scroll out and take a look at this file. It sets this Django settings module, which you can see is required here for this initial command, where all these different commands we can now invoke through the manage.py file. But if you want an idea of the different things that are possible, such as run server, which we did through manage.py, we don't have to worry about this Django settings module because this manage.py file does it for us. So to conclude that little ramble there, the Django admin is used one time on initial setup, and then from there we're going to use the manage.py to execute all those commands for us, which will make sure the environment is set up properly, and we don't have to worry about any of those errors from the django-admin command. Whew, okay, that's it for this video. So we have a Django project, and you can see the files in it are in this files here. You'll get very familiar with the way these files are set up. What we're going to do now is, before we start messing all this stuff up and ruining our beautiful application right here, we're going to check all this stuff into a repository so we can always have checkpoints and go back to those checkpoints if we mess something up or we need to look back at our earlier code. So the next video we're going to talk about Git. Stay tuned. I appreciate you sticking with this course so far. Hopefully it's been helpful, and we'll see you in the next one.